Okay, and I think we are now live. So, hi everyone. Welcome back if you were just watching my TV and film wrap up. Hello if you're joining me now just for this one. For those new here, my name is Nicki. I'm an author and editor, and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading, and all the other things I love. And it's pretty much the end of the month, so it's time for my reading wrap up. Time to share what books I've been reading, what I've enjoyed during October. So, without any further ado, we will crack on because I do have around 20 or so, as usual, to get through. So I don't want to drag this on for 10 hours or anything. So first off is a book that I actually read in September. And I'd saved it until the very end of my live stream as a nice one to finish with, and then completely forgot to mention it. So I am talking about it now in October instead. So the book in question is Death Note. So this is the manga by Tsugumi Ohba and Takeshi Obata. This is a 5-star read for me. If you've heard some of my other videos recently, you'll know that I've become a huge fan of Death Note. I've been devouring everything, the manga, the anime, live action films, the musical. Everything Death Note is good by me. So for those who are not familiar with it, the basic premise of this story is that Shinigami, gods of death, have notebooks in which they write human names, and if they write your name in the notebook, you would die, and they would assume whatever years of your life were left for their own lifespan. One of these Shinigami, named Ryuk, is bored. Essentially, he's up in the Shinigami world, looking down at the humans, nothing much is happening. So he decides to have a bit of fun, and he drops a notebook to Earth, where it's picked up by Yagami Lighto. And Light is a high school student, his father's chief of police, and he has a very strong sense of justice. So he begins using this notebook to kill murderers, criminals, anyone who's been getting away with the crime, who hasn't been punished properly, in his view. Of course, the police don't take too kindly to this because it's still murder, even if he's killing bad people. So they begin to pursue him, aided by a mastermind young detective called L. And so the story essentially becomes a standoff between Light and L, each of them very intelligent young men who are battling wits against each other. L wants to find Light to punish him, and Light wants to find L so that he can learn his name and get rid of him because he's in his way. So that's the basic premise of the story anyway. It's really entertaining, it's really action-packed, it's brilliant. I like the design, the look of the manga, everything about it's just great. So yes, go read it, go read Death Note. Okay, next up was The Lost Ones by Anita Frank. And I received this book as an ARC from the publisher. Essentially, it's a historical ghost story. So if that's your kind of thing, and you know, it's the time of year for it in particular, isn't it? You might want to check it out. It's a 4-star read for me. I'm really reluctant to say anything more about the story because of the spoiler issues with a book like this. So just know it's a young woman goes to the house. There seem to be ghosts around. There's a bit of suspicious activity. What's the family hiding, kind of thing. So yes, obviously there's a lot of skeptics around her as well who think that she's just like delusional and want to put her away in a mental asylum. But she's determined to discover the truth. So that's the premise. If that sounds like your sort of thing, you want a Halloween ghost story, check out The Lost Ones by Anita Frank. Next up, 2 books I borrowed from the library, 2 books in a trilogy, Nevernight and Godsgrave by J. Kristoff. I'm waiting. I've got Dark Dawn, the final book, on request at the library, but it's being borrowed by someone else at the moment. So I'm just waiting to get that so I can finish it off. I'm really enjoying this series. Nevernight was definitely a 5-star read for me. Godsgrave, 4.5. I think it didn't quite have the magic of the first one, but it was still really enjoyable. This is a YA fantasy with assassins. It's quite bloody in some ways, and fairly adult. I think I've seen it classed as adult fantasy and YA fantasy in different places. So I'm not really entirely sure which audience it's aimed at. It is fairly mature, a very mature YA, if it is YA. And I really enjoyed, what I really enjoyed about this one was the style. It's very different from most other YA fantasies I've read. I mean, Kristoff has a sort of author voice in which he does all these footnotes and does all these asides to the reader. I mean, there's some hugely funny ones. He gives one of the characters an amusing name, and when I first read it, I was kind of having a bit of a giggle. And then I see there's a footnote, and when you go down and read the footnote, it's like, you know, stop laughing, you know, what are you, 2 years old? So, you know, all these little funny asides, which may not be to everyone's taste, but I found really refreshing and great fun. And there's plenty of action, a bit of romance going on, a bit of LGBT romance, if that's your thing. It's quite dark, and yeah, overall, just a really enjoyable YA fantasy. Again, I don't want to spoil it too much, but it involves sort of a girl who can talk to these sort of shadow creatures, one of whom assumes the form of a cat, and the other one a wolf. And it's just great fun. It's really inventive, really imaginative. So definitely, yeah, go read it. Go check it out if you haven't. I'm really glad I finally got around to picking it up. And I hope I shall enjoy the final volume, which fingers crossed I'll get soon. Moving along, I read a book from NetGalley, which was The Weaver by Heather Kindt. The premise of this one is an author whose characters come alive, which, as an author myself, I mean, that sounded like brilliant fun. I'd love if some of my characters really came to life and I got to meet them. The premise was the best thing about this book. I think I gave it 3 stars. It had such potential. And yet I think it kind of fell down. I wanted more from it. It felt a little bit cliched. I mean, as soon as she meets her villain character in the real world, she recognizes him straight away. And she's like, oh my goodness, it's the guy from my story. How can this be? Kind of thing. But then the hero comes into her world too. And the second we meet him, it's obvious to me as a reader that that's who he is. And yet she seems completely oblivious to it for chapters and chapters. And it's like, how dense are you, woman? I just kind of wanted to knock her about a bit sometimes. And yeah, it just felt a little bit contrived at times and cliched, which is a shame because the idea had such potential. It just wasn't quite realised. I mean, this is going to be the first book, I think, in a trilogy, at least a duology. I think it's a trilogy. But from this first one, I wasn't hugely inspired to read on. If I came across a copy, maybe I would, but I won't be seeking it out, let's say. Sticking with the NetGalley read, the next one I picked up was The God Game by Tobey. This was a 4.5 star read for me. It basically is an idea that it's kind of a virtual reality game that you can start playing on your phone or your computer. But it begins to blur game and reality, and in order to keep with the game, you have to start doing all these tasks in real life that become slightly dubious, vandalism being one of the least of them. And if you try to get out of the game or do something wrong, then you risk actual physical harm in the real world as retaliation. I think it's quite a timely topic considering the way technology is going these days. It was a really fun, fast-paced, thrilling tale. Plenty of on the edge of your seat action. You kept wanting to turn the page to find out what would happen next. So if that kind of sort of technology thriller is your sort of thing, I definitely recommend checking out The God Game. Next up, I borrowed a few books from the library, and I'll whiz through these fairly quick. They're all 3 are non-fiction, and they're all to do with my Japanese studies. So I got Japanese Kanji for Beginners by Stout and Hakone. This was my favourite of the 3. This was a 5-star read for me. I think it's a really great resource. It does about the first 400 or so kanji for the levels 5 and 4, which is what I'm on at the moment. I'm literally just starting out with kanji. So it's got them all nicely presented, plenty of information, how to draw the kanji, different pronunciation options for them, like different ways they might be said, and some examples of using them in words and things. And then exercises at the end of each section so you can kind of test your knowledge of the ones you've just been learning. So really nicely presented, great resource for anyone learning Japanese. The next up was Japanese Kanji Made Easy by Michael K. Kluemper. This was only 3 stars for me. It takes the kanji and it really focuses on putting them in a kind of mnemonic way that's meant to help you remember them. However, I found that the mnemonics they used really confusing at times. the way that when it was situated behind the kanji made the kanji a bit hard to read sometimes. And sometimes it would have taken more effort for me to try to memorize this little bit of text that's meant to help me remember the kanji. It would be much easier just for me to learn the kanji without any kind of like little aide de memoire bit of spiel about it. Because some of them, to me, like, I was like, well, why? That just doesn't make any sense. But that's just me. If you're someone who learns better in that kind of style, then this is probably a great book for you. But for me personally, I didn't think it was the right way for me to learn this stuff. And finally, I got Japanese for Dummies by Chiba and Sato. So this one was 3.5 stars from me. It's one of the 4 Dummies series. It had a few bits of useful information. I jotted down a few notes here and there. But the way it was presented felt more like you were just learning phrases for a holiday, for a trip, or for business kind of thing, as opposed to really getting a grasp on the bones of the language, if you like. It had a bit of grammar here and there, but I felt it was really more throwing phrases at you, and some of them weren't really relevant for what I'm trying to learn in my current stage of Japanese learning. So 3.5, it was okay, but it's very basic and really skewed towards phrase memory learning as opposed to getting the gist of the grammar and the language as a whole. Next up, we are back to NetGalley, and I read The Vine Witch by Luanne G. Smith. This was quite a fun story. I gave it 4 stars. And it's a historical fantasy, and a young woman who's a witch has been cursed, and she's managed to break the curse at last and has returned to her home, where she used to work as a vine witch, making sure that all the grapes for the wine were at the best quality possible to get the best vintage. She arrives to discover that the place has been sold to this guy who she's never met before, and the vineyard is in dire peril, and it's covered in curses, and the vines are dying. And so the story is her trying to fix that while also investigating who put the curse on her and got her out of the way to begin with. Again, I can't really say too much more without spoiling, but it was an enjoyable story. I thought the world building worked quite well. It was nicely integrated into the tale, into the action. And definitely I would pick up more from this author in the future. Next up was an ARC I received from the publisher, and it's The World That We Knew by Alice Hoffman. And this is another historical with magical realism. So it's set during World War II, but it involves sort of the Jewish golem elements, Jewish folklore and things like that as well. It was an interesting read. I kind of wanted a little bit more from the magical realism side at times. We had some really great moments, but then we'd kind of just leave that alone and go off into just an average historical drama. And when it came back, it just felt like it was coming back for the sake of it, and you were wondering what had been going on in the meantime. It was 4 stars for me, because, I mean, Hoffman does write really well. She has really enjoyable prose, but for me, this particular story, I kind of found my attention wandering now and then when we left that those magical elements behind and just got into the secondary characters' historical dramas. It kind of lost interest for me a little bit in those moments. So if you're a fan of Hoffman's writing, I think you'll definitely find something to enjoy in this new book. I don't think it's the best one to come to if you're reading her work for the first time. I would recommend something else, maybe The Dove Keepers. But yeah, if you're a fan, of course, you're going to find something you like here and something to take away. Excuse me, I'm just kind of like waffling while I just catch up with my ticking off here. Right, I'm back with you. So next up, 2 books I bought, and going back, in fact, to Death Note. So these are 2 novels that are based around the Death Note world in a way, although none of them really involve the Death Note. So there's Death Note, Another Note, which was written by Nisioisin, and this story is looking at one of L's previous investigations. So L, who's the detective figure in Death Note, he previously worked a murder case with Naomi, who is another minor character from Death Note. So it's kind of like a sort of flashback to to what they did together in this investigation. And so there's mentions of elements of the Death Note storyline, but only in passing, done by the narrator. It's not really a main aspect of the story. But even so, I enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. It was still great fun. There was a twist that I didn't see coming, actually. It took me by surprise. I thought I'd worked everything out, and then I was like, hang on a second. So it was really entertaining and great fun to read. Next up was L Change the World by M. This one was only 3 for me, 3 stars. It wasn't as good as the film. Now, interestingly, this book came after the film, I believe. So they did a film called L Change the World, which the basic premise is L's name's been written in the Death Note. He's got 23 days to live, and he's trying to wrap up cases. And along the way, he gets drawn into this investigation with this stuff with these drugs going on, and they're trying to sort of do a genocide to limit the population on the earth. Bit of a Thanos, actually. It's a bit of a Thanos theme. We're trying to get rid of some of the population, thin things out a bit to save the planet. That's what the baddies think they're doing anyway. And so L has to stop them before he runs out of time. And the film was actually quite entertaining. It was enjoyable, a bit of fun. The book, though, it wasn't as good as the film. And I think part of the reason for that is they changed things. And I'm not sure why. Because you're writing a novel based on the film. Why would you not just follow the film? But they changed the storyline. They take stuff out, put other things in. And it just didn't work as well for me. I wasn't gripped. I was just kind of like skimming through it a lot. So in the case of this one, if you've got the choice, I would see the film rather than read the book, because I think it works better in that format. Next up, I've got another arc from the publisher for Supernova by Marissa Meyer. Now, this is the final book in the Renegades trilogy, which is a YA superhero story. I've really enjoyed this series, I have to say. This one got 5 stars from me. I think it was a good conclusion. It kind of really wrapped everything up nicely. There was plenty of action, plenty of excitement. I felt the ending worked. I wasn't sort of disappointed in the way things turned out. So yeah, if you're into superhero stories, definitely check out the Renegades series, because it hits all the tropes that you'd want from a superhero story, but also has a kind of fresh feel as well. Next up was a book written by my very good friend Alina Popescu, and Alina has just branched into writing cozies, murder mysteries, and this book she put up for free for a short time, which is a prequel to the new series she's just launching, which is kind of a geeky, cozy murder mystery series. So this one's called Murderous Affair. It's just a sort of long short story / novella length piece, and I found it really enjoyable. It was a fun little mystery. It kept me guessing. I loved the main character, and I definitely want to see her doing some more sleuthing in the future. There were loads of fun little anime and manga references for the anime and manga fans among you out there. And I'm interested to see where she's going to take the character and the stories through this series now. So do check that out. That one's now out, and I think the first book in the series is either just out or just about to release. So do take a look for those. Next up, I read Modern Coloured Pencil by Chelsea Ward, and this was a Galley Read. So it's a non-fiction art, how to draw kind of book that we've got going on there. It was what did I give it? 4 stars, I think. Yes, 4 stars for me. I think it was a good beginner's guide. It had a lot of great information on choosing the type of pencils, type of paper, introduction to things like colour theory, and then it looked at different styles of drawing, everything from still life to figures. So if you want a good overview of pencil drawing, particularly coloured pencil rather than just graphite drawing, then do check out this book. Next up was another book I received from the publisher, and it is The Girl Who Reads on the Metro by Christine Féret-Fleury. So this is a book translated from French. Apparently she's a fairly well-known children's author in France. This is an adult work, but it's the first book of hers translated into English. And for me, this was a 4-star read. It's kind of chick lit, really. It's not the sort of thing I would normally pick up. But when I read the premise on Pam Macmillan's media release email, it sounded cute and fun. So I decided to give it a try, even though it's not my usual fare. I gave it 4 stars. It was a really sweet, easygoing read. There's lots of fun literary references for the sort of book geeks among you. It's not one I'd rush back and reread again and again and again. I think it had a few nice thought-provoking points, but mainly it was just sweet fun. Nice light reading. I mean, we're heading into the summer here in Australia. It's the kind of book you could take to the beach and just chill out with. It's that kind of read. So if that sounds like your sort of thing, do have a look at that one. Sticking with books I received from the publisher, I also read Deep Light by Frances Hardinge. This is my first book by Hardinge. I've never actually heard of her before, but on the basis of this one, I would definitely want to check out some of her other works. She's writing fantasy / magical realism, I guess you'd say. And this book is set in a fantasy world in which there were all these underwater gods who essentially were worshipped by the islanders in this sort of group of islands. However, one day all the gods started fighting each other until none of them were left. And so since then, people have been going down in submarines to salvage parts of their body because they can use it. They call it godware. They can turn it into things and it's worth a lot of money. So that's the sort of premise at the start of the story. And Hark is our hero. And he gets caught up in this mystery that involves what is the actual origin of the gods? Where did they come from? And what was the truth behind the worship of them? And do we want them back? Because people are playing around with forces he discovers that maybe they shouldn't be. It's really hard to describe any more than that without spoiling, but it's kind of a mix of fantasy magic with technology, all this kind of submarine tech and things. It was great fun. The world building in particular was brilliant. I thought the way that Hardinge integrated different elements in it, it all flowed so beautifully. It never felt like info dumping, and yet you got a really wonderful sense of the world, the mythology that these characters had grown up with. The characters themselves were the only slight letdown for me because I didn't connect with them as deeply as I would have liked to, which is why it got 4 stars, not 5. But still, it was incredibly enjoyable. And on the basis of this, I would want to go and look at some of her older works and maybe read some more stuff by her. Next up, a Galley Read was Vampires of Lore by A.P. Sylvia. And this is a book that's non-fiction, and it's basically looking at the folklore behind vampires and how that relates to the sort of modern pop culture idea of vampires that we have now, like how much of it is based in folklore, how much of it has just come from fiction. I gave this one 4 stars. It's perfectly fine. It's nicely laid out. It's done in terms of traits. So there's a section on garlic, a section on stakes through the heart, that kind of thing. And in that way, it's a really nice book you could just dip into. You don't have to sit and read through it from start to finish. The only reason I gave it 4 stars, not 5, is there's not really anything new here. I've read quite a lot on the folklore behind vampires before. So it was all pretty familiar stuff that I've come across in the past. There wasn't anything groundbreaking. However, if you're someone who's only ever read fictional vampires and hasn't done any research into the folklore, then this is a nice volume for sort of introducing you to some of those ideas, which is why I gave it 4 stars. So yeah, if you're into vampires and you don't know a lot about where some of these stories and where some of the ideas behind vampires and silver, garlic, crosses, all that come from, then it's worth checking out. Next up, I read Night of Knives by V. Schwab. So this is the second book in the Still Prince graphic novel series, the second of what will be a trilogy. And I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I think it was a good continuation. I don't think it necessarily was quite as entertaining as the first one, but that's always the problem with middle chapters. You've done your introduction and set everything up, and now you've just got to kind of get things ready for the conclusion. So I did like some of the ideas behind the Night of Knives trials. I think those were quite effective and well done. And the story did set us up really well to move into the final volume. So I'm looking forward to that. I think it's out in about March time. So I can't wait to see how the story is going to end then. And next I read Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Now, this is the first book in Bardugo's new adult fantasy series, so separate from Grishaverse. This one was a 5-star read for me. It took me a little while to get into it, I have to say. The first few chapters I was thinking, well, it's okay, but I wasn't hooked. And then suddenly we hit a point, I think about a third through, when suddenly everything kicked off and I was absolutely drawn into the world and I'm desperate to know what was going to happen next. Some of my favourite characters, I mean, Alex is our heroine and I liked her, but actually some of my favourite characters were North and Darlington, who both of them, they're secondary characters really, but one of them will definitely be coming back in book 2, and I kind of hope the second one will as well, because I did really love North. I think he was brilliant, so I hope we do see him again. And I liked Alex's interaction with the ghosts. Once that stuff started to kick off, I think was when the story really picked up. So I'm really excited to see where this series, this trilogy is going to go as we get to book 2. I'm not sure how long we've got to wait for that. I'm guessing probably a yearish, but yeah, I think it was really great. It was a slow start, but it's really worth persevering through those early chapters, because then it does absolutely get going and it's really enjoyable. Perhaps not as immediately accessible as Grishaverse, but as I said, if you stick with it, it really repays your attention and your time. That pretty much brings me towards the end. I mean, I've been reading a lot of manga still, so I'm still working my way through Tokyo Ghoul by Sui Ishida. I've read up to number 9. I've got number 10 on request at the library, and after I've got that one, it's out with someone else at the moment. Once I've done that one, I'll request 11 and 12, and then that's as far as we're up to with the library at the moment. I've got to wait until they get 13 in, and then I think 14, 15, 16 release over the next sort of 6 months or so. So it could be a little while before I get to finish it, depending on how quickly the library acquires them and how many people get in front of me in the queue requesting them. But I will eventually finish, and I should be able to catch up, hopefully, by the end of the year, up to 12 at least. And then I'll just have the last 4 to go. And also Black Butler. I was reading Black Butler from the library, but I loved it so much that when I got an unexpected royalty check the other day, I splurged and bought them all. So I've read up to 24 so far. I've got 25, 26, 27 here on my shelf, which I'm going to be reading over the next few days. And 28 is in the mail. It should arrive in the post any day now, certainly by this time next week at the latest. And I'll be able to finish off. I mean, I say finish off, obviously the manga is still ongoing, but I'll be up to date then with the ones that have been published in combined book form. So then I'll just have to wait until they bring out future volumes to continue the story after that. So I will definitely, for Black Butler, I'll be giving you a proper full review up to volume 28 next month. And for Tokyo Ghoul, I will do up to 12 once I've read that far, and I'm caught up with that one as much as I can be. So that brings us to the end for today. I've got a few books lined up at the moment that I'm reading for November, so I look forward to sharing those with you in a few weeks' time. I will end there for now, but I will see you all again very soon for another vlog. Bye for now, everyone.